Welcome, fans, to another edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast here live on the Hannibal TV on YouTube. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling, and I'm very pleased today to welcome a man who really had a very accomplished and diverse career in the dying sort of days of the territory system, and really made his mark. Especially for a young fan for me in the Vancouver-based All-Star Wrestling, but of course was in Montreal, Grand Prix, Portland, Puerto Rico, several other locales that we'll get to. And I'm very pleased tonight to be welcoming the legendary performer wrestler known as Rocky Della. Rocky, thank you for coming on today, sir.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me. I look forward to this interview. And yeah, you asked the questions, I've got the answers.
That's excellent. We'll talk about your promo style in a bit, because I certainly remember that from my early fandom. But I think the fans would be interested to know, first and foremost, right off the hop, that your autobiography is out, and it's called Wrestling with a Rocky Life. We'll get to where they can pick that up, and I would highly encourage that later on in the interview. But I think they find as a baseline that the fans like to hear if you were a fan of the pro wrestling business growing up, and if so, what territories or promotions did you follow? I know you were a standout athlete, though.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I started with professional wrestling like every young boy. Me and my brother Bob, who's also an ex-wrestler, and all the fans will know him. We used to watch it on TV on Saturday afternoons, just like everybody else. And if I can remember, it was the first show I ever saw, I'm pretty sure was I think it was that All-Star Wrestling, but I think they might have called it Big Time Wrestling at that time. I'm not sure. But I know there was one wrestler that my brother used to imitate in the kitchen in my mother's house. His name was Bad Boy Shields. And Bad Boy was real bad. So my brother kind of liked him. And my brother Bob, well, he was a little bad himself. Anyways, we'd watch the show, and Bad Boys, then all of a sudden he'd start imitating Bad Boy Shields, and he'd jump on me, and he was like maybe 15 years old, and I was like 6, 7 years old. And, all of a sudden I saw Big Bob coming at me, imitating Bad Boy Shields. And next thing you know, he's acting like Bad Boy, and I'm laughing, and we're just having fun. So, we started watching it then. And, we, like everybody else at that time, and we're talking about maybe, I'd say late 60s, mid 60s, when wrestling was really territory wrestling was very popular. And it was kind of like I don't know how to, it was like when I think back now, it was so nostalgic, and it looked real, and the characters were incredible. And I remember seeing Gene Kiniski and Rocky Johnson on that same wrestling show. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. And that's how me and Bob started kind of getting liking wrestling.
Was there a moment when I understand that your brother preceded you in the business, but was there a particular point that you decided, I'm going to pursue this as a career yourself?
Well, I think I started thinking about pursuing it as a career, because my brother, he got started, like you say, before me, because he's almost 7 years older than me. And he started with Grand Prix Wrestling. He used to know, he met Edouard Carpentier. I'm sure you know Edouard Carpentier.
Yes, sir.
He was a big name in Quebec, and big name, international name. And they started Grand Prix Wrestling, and he started a wrestling school. And I guess Bob bumped into him at the old YMCA in downtown Montreal, and Edouard told him, you're a big guy and everything, and I'm opening up a wrestling school. If you're interested, come on down and we'll talk. And that's how he got started, was with the Grand Prix Wrestling School, when Grand Prix Wrestling was at its peak. And we're talking Grand Prix Wrestling was run by Edouard Carpentier, Yvon Robert Jr., Mad Dog Vachon. So there was like about 3 or 4 or 5, how can I say, partners in that promotion. And these are all big name wrestlers. So that Grand Prix Wrestling just took off the ground. And at the same time, there was Les Aus la Lutte, I'll say it in French, Les Aus la Lutte, which means All-Star Wrestling in Montreal. And that was run by Johnny and Jacques Rougeau Sr. And those 2 promotions would go head to head and sell out the old Montreal Forum in Montreal, where the Montreal Canadiens won all their Stanley Cups. And they would run that building in the same month, and both wrestling promotions would sell the Forum out. 18,000 people, imagine that. Mm-hmm. So wrestling was definitely, Montreal was definitely a hotbed for wrestling.
Mm-hmm. When you did make that choice to pursue it as a career, can you talk about your training process and what that entailed? Because sorry, go ahead.
I had a very unique wrestling training process. My brother got to go to a wrestling school. Myself, I wasn't as lucky, but I was lucky in other ways because I had an older brother in the business that was able to, open a few doors here and there. And so Bob, after he started with Grand Prix, started wrestling for the Grand Prix wrestling promotion in Montreal. And then all of a sudden this promoter, Edmund Schobert from Hanover, Germany, came to Montreal and scouted a wrestling show and decided that he wanted to bring Bob to Germany. And at that time, Bob had just started this wrestling gimmick called the UFO. And back in the 70s, the UFO was a hot item. People were saying that they saw UFOs here and there and everywhere. Well, whatever. But of course, they were smoking things a lot back then too, and that make them see that UFOs. But anyway, make a long story short, he got the gimmick from Johnny War Eagle. And Johnny War Eagle was a native indigenous wrestler in Montreal. He was a big name, and he was a tag team with Billy Two Rivers. Anyway, he got the gimmick from Johnny. He started the UFO gimmick. Schobert sees him at a wrestling show in Montreal and says, I want to bring you, because we've never had a masked man in Germany. And he said, yeah, I'm going to bring you to Hanover. And they have a wrestling show for 2 months there. It's called the October Festival Wrestling Show. And he brought in Yvon Robert Jr., Bob, and a couple other wrestlers, Johnny War Eagle. And Bob's gimmick as the UFO just took off the ground. So make a long story short, after a few more years, Bob had wrestled there 6-7 years in Europe. I think he was spending half his life, like half the year he would spend in Europe, sometimes not only wrestling in Germany, but in France, Austria, Belgium. And then his promoter, Mr. Schobert, came to Montreal to see Bob, because Bob all of a sudden took over some of his, how can I say, scouting of North American wrestlers at the same time being a wrestler for him. So Mr. Schobert comes to my parents' house, and I'm about 18 years old at that time. And he looked at me, and I was working out, and I was, I had done a lot of Olympic wrestling. I was about 18 years old, going on 19 years old. And Mr. Schobert looked at me and he said to Bob, your brother here, Rocky, I think he should get into wrestling business. He looks like he could be a wrestler right now. All we got to do is get him the training. So all of a sudden, this was always in the back of my mind to get in the business. And Mr. Schobert now all of a sudden is opening a door. He says, if your brother gets the training, he can come and wrestle in Germany also. So this is the not too great part of the story, is that there was really no wrestling school back in Montreal at that time. And we're talking like 1978. So there is this parish in Montreal called Saint-Jean-Baptiste that used to run wrestling shows, believe it or not, every Sunday, and get beginner wrestlers to come down and donate their time, and they would raise money for the church parish. And at the same time, these young guys would get training there. So after Mr. Schobert left Germany, my brother Bob said, well, why don't you go down to that parish? And I think the gentleman there that was in charge of the wrestling training, his name was Pat Girard. He was a big name wrestler in England. And I guess he had been retired from wrestling and blah, blah, blah. And so he started being a wrestling teacher at the parish. And so Bob tells me, well, why don't you go see Pat Girard and see if you can get some training with him before you come to Germany. So I go to see him and I ask him, I says, well, do you think I can get some training? I can, because I got an opportunity to go to Germany to wrestle. And he looked at me and he says, no. He says, I can't train you. Maybe go see Jack Britton. Go talk to your brother. Go see Gino Brito, but I can't help you. So I said, wow, okay, all right. So I was kind of feeling a little bit funny about that. But now when I think back on the story, I guess it was a little bit of discrimination because growing up in Montreal, my parents sent me to English school, even though we grew up in a French neighborhood. I felt like when I look back now, it was just basic discrimination that because I was an Anglophone, my ancestry is Italian, but my first language is English growing up in Canada. And being in Montreal, being an Anglophone was at a bit of a disadvantage that way back then, I guess. I got no training from him and there was nowhere else to go train. And even if I asked Bob to train me, we didn't have access to a wrestling ring. So one day my brother Bob says, well, let's go in the yard and I'll show you a couple of pro wrestling holds in my father's backyard. And so my dad, he's this old Italian guy. He, his grass was his grass was meticulous. You didn't walk on his grass. But anyway, the old man was at work that day. So we go in the backyard and Bob shows me a few holds, headlock, arm bar, this and that. And next thing you know, Bob is wrestling that night at the Verdun Auditorium for Jack Britton. And he starts taking his shower. My father comes home and he goes, who in the hell was rolling around my backyard grass? What the hell are you guys doing? Next time, go to the park and do that. So anyway, Bob looks at me and says, Rocky, let's get going. Let's get out of here. Let's go to the show. The old man's screaming, let's get out of here. So we go to the show. And I'm just going there with Bob tagging along and going to watch him wrestle. And the next thing, the wrestling promoter at that time was Jack Britton. And so Jack, he was stuck for a wrestler that night. Now, he looks at me and he looks at Bob and he says, your brother there, has he been trained yet? Do you think he can get in the ring and pull off a match? I'm going, oh, no way, I can't do that. First of all, I got no wrestling boots. I got no trunks. So next thing you know, Bob goes, well, Jerry, Rocky, come here. I'll lend you my boots and I can lend you my trunks and just give them back to me after your match. I'm going, what? You taught me 2 holds this afternoon. Now I'm supposed to go in the ring in front of 500 people and wrestle? And Jack Britton goes, oh, listen, kid, you just got to do maybe 10 minutes with Louis Laurence. And I'm going, you guys are joking. You're joking. So I said, what the hell? Okay, I'll do it. Now, the only background I really had was I did amateur wrestling at the old YMCA in Montreal when I was a kid. And, I still was doing a little bit here and there. But so I had that little bit of knowledge of, the lockup and this and that. But, 2 wrestling holds, give me a break. So here I am. I'm putting on Bob's wrestling boots, which his feet are about an inch bigger than mine. Wow. And I'm putting his trunks on, and his trunks fit okay. But I put his boots on, and I hear him going and says, "Whoa, this is a fast way to get into the wrestling business." So I walk to the ring, and it had to be the longest walk of my life. And there's Louis Laurence waiting for me in the ring, and we have what you call a babyface match, like 2 good guys shaking their hands and doing a scientific match. They used to call it back then. So I get in the ring, and I'm nervous as hell. But anyway, I get in there, and we do a few things here and there. I just kind of go with the flow with Louis, and I guess he thought I had more experience, even though he knew it was my first match. He thought I had more experience than that. So he throws me into the ropes and he goes, sunset flip. Now, this is where you roll over the wrestler that goes down and try and give you like a backdrop, but you roll over him and get into a pinfall position. Well, I'd never done a sunset flip in my life. So next thing you know, I go over Louis, and my head, instead of tucking my head down, and my head went straight, hit the mat. And it's a good thing I got a hard head, because I'm telling you, later on, I come back to the dressing room. Bob told me, he says, when you hit the mat, he says, we could hear the sound of the boards all over the building.
Not a lot of padding in those days either, was there?
No, and listen, a lot of people think that a pro wrestling ring is a trampoline. It's not. I mean, there's some rings that are harder than others. There is a little bit of a give. But there's wood, there's a little bit of padding, there's a canvas, a little bit of a spring, so that wrestlers can get a little bit of a jump when they do their flying drop kicks and this and that. But a wrestling ring, you can get winded very easily there. But anyway, that day, that on that move there, it wasn't me getting winded, it was my head getting winded. And yeah. So, I come back after the match, and I guess Louis took the fall with a quick small package. And, Jack Britton looks at me and he goes, well, you did okay. You don't have that much experience. Well, I said, listen, I've never had any training. So in my mind, that's what I'm saying to myself. But yeah, that's how I got my start as a professional wrestler. And this was May 1978 at the Verdun Auditorium.
Wow. Talk about being thrown right into it.
Right in there. Yeah.
Speaking of which, I noticed one of shortly thereafter, at least chronologically, according to the record, when you were breaking in, you had a match on TV against Dino Bravo.
Okay.
Do you remember that one?
I think I did a match with Dino Bravo. This was like back in 1978, probably when I just came back, because I actually did go to
and work in Germany, right?
I did, yeah. And I think I came back, and my friend, well, also Bob's friend, Joe Ventura, was also known as Joe Lightfoot, Montreal guy, and a good friend of mine. He said, listen, they need some guys to go down and work on TV in Hamilton for, I think it was the Tunnies, Frank Tunney, or Jim Tunney, I forget the promoter's name then. And we went and did TV, and I'm pretty sure, I had one match with Dino, and I think I had a match with Tony Atlas.
Was that given the the Maple Leaf Wrestling name and the TV exposure in Canada, was that that must have been an intimidating experience for you, especially when Dino Bravo was a huge name at that time?
Well, the thing is that it is always intimidating, when you're especially when you're starting in the business. I mean, it was intimidating enough to work with Louis, knowing two wrestling holds. But to go in the ring and wrestle Dino Bravo, big name, was kind of like my childhood. I looked up to Dino, kind of like a mentor. I always thought, I liked his style and would kind of like maybe emulate him a little bit myself. But yeah, the wrestling Dino Bravo was not intimidating, because I was actually smart to wrestling, because my brother started back in 1970, and so I was like 13 years old roughly at that time. So I was already listening to him talk and stuff, and already knew I was basically smart to wrestling, and knew the ins and outs, not 100%, but quite a bit. So I've never been overly tense going in that ring. I've always been relaxed. It's just something about me when I go in the wrestling ring. I don't push the panic button, because there's no sense in pushing the panic button. It's going to be either there tonight that we've got the crowd and everybody's enjoying the match, or it's not. So,
Mm, mm.
you just got to go in there, relax, and not push the panic button, and things will fall in place.
Yeah, and then you transitioned, according to my research, to
Mhm.
the All Star Wrestling territory out of Vancouver when it was still an NWA affiliate, if memory serves me correct. Can
Correct.
can you talk about how that came to be initially? How you were booked there?
How I was booked there, well, first of all, my brother Bob went there. The first, like, he got booked because Moose Morowski used to wrestle in Europe, and I remember seeing Moose. He was a big name on All Star Wrestling. Everybody knows Moose. Anybody who's watched All Star Wrestling will know that Moose. And the first time I saw Moose Morowski in the dressing room in Germany, I looked at him and I said, "That's like a mini Don Leo Jonathan."
Mm.
He had the same sideburns. He wore the same type of jacket, suit, and pants, and kind of had it looked like Don Leo a little bit. But anyway, I remember Moose, talking to my brother about maybe Bob going to Vancouver and wrestling there. So Bob went there and worked in Vancouver along with Joe Ventura, and then I followed along and I went to work there also. I didn't have a whole lot of experience at that point. Um, Very minimal experience, other than my experience in Germany and working for the Tunnies on television. I went to work for um, Vancouver Wrestling, All Star Wrestling, and that's when I met the promoter at that time. It was Al Tomko, and I guess Al was in partnership with Gene Kiniski and Don Owens in Portland, and yeah, they were part affiliated with the NWA.
Yeah, and I guess when you got there, Tomko had purchased Sandor Kovac's end of the promotion, and of course Al was promoting out of Winnipeg. What were your initial impressions of Al, given that he had from what people say a larger than life presence, so to speak?
My impressions of Al, I mean, I was so young at that time. I was like, 20 years old. So, I wasn't paying attention too much to, Al. But I got to know Al more and more over the years. And my impression of Al is that, he was, just he was kind of like, he looked like a wrestling promoter for some reason. He just had that look. And he was a great guy to work for. I've had my ins and outs with Al, but everybody has, with the boss. But he was he. When I look back now, especially now that I've gotten older and I realize, what it takes to be a wrestling promoter, um, he was a great guy. I got nothing bad to say about him. As a matter of fact, every time after that, whenever I, was looking for a place to go wrestle, I just pick up the phone and ask Al, and Al said, "Hey, Rocky, come on down. You're always welcome here." So I got nothing but good things to say about Al Tonko, for sure.
And along those lines, there seems to be, in the historical record, some historians talk about well, when Al took over All Star, and I think a lot of it is perhaps unfair too, given the end of the territorial era and the expansion of the WWF at the time. They said that Al, his legacy somewhat is tarnished by the fact that he pushed himself as the top draw when he was past his prime physically, and they put a lot of the which we'll get into in more detail, but a lot of the decline of the All-Star territory on Al, which again is debatable. What are your thoughts on that particular aspect?
Well, I mean, I guess what was happening with Al is I think he made a lot of money being a promoter for the AWA in Winnipeg, working along with Vern Gagne. And then he came in and invested all that money. He had invested a lot of money in the All Star Wrestling to get and then he ended up buying out Gene Kiniski and buying out Don Owens, and I'm sure that must have been very expensive. And so what was going on there with the All-Star Wrestling is that he probably put himself in there because he just couldn't afford, or was watching his dollar and figured, well, I'll put myself on top and see if I can draw some money. And one thing about Al, he was good on a microphone. He could talk and he can put something over as a talker, but in the ring, he wasn't really overly athletically inclined. And by the time he put himself in that ring, he was over the hill physically. So, and he just wasn't, myself, when I used to watch him, and a lot of guys have told me that they worked with Al, and I think I worked with him one time. He wasn't, he wasn't Ric Flair by any means, and so, but he tried, and a lot of the reasons why he put himself in there and put himself over was that, he was looking for cutting back on expenses.
Yeah, that makes sense. The Jerry Lawler Memphis thing.
Yeah. And then, I started, and I witnessed it also. Al was using a lot of wrestlers that towards the end of All-Star Wrestling that really, as far as I was concerned, when I thought about it, like, we're not credible athletes, and that they shouldn't have really been put in that ring because, and like, these guys were not guys that went to the gym and worked out or didn't have the athletic ability. So he put some guys in that ring, I thought at the end, that shouldn't have represented professional wrestling.
We'll for the next portion of the interview, I want to go through a name association with some of the all-star talents that you work with. But a fan on social media wanted me to send a question to you to ask about the shots that you worked for Stu Hart in Stampede and specifically against Dynamite Kid. Memories of Stu and working Dynamite.
Well, the memories of Stu, I'm sure a lot of wrestlers, have stories about how, because when I worked for Stu, it was 1980. I went there in the springtime, and supposedly I was booked, and so I get to Calgary and I go to the wrestling show with my gear and everything. I'm all ready to wrestle, and I guess Bret Hart was the guy in charge. Like, he was kind of like the booker, and he was in charge of the dressing room and so forth. And so I go up to Bret and I said, well, Bret, Stu told me I'm starting tonight and blah, blah, blah. And he looked at me and he goes, well, I don't know who told you to come here because we don't need anybody right now. So I go, okay. All right, that's fine. So I just stuck around that night. I says, here's my number. If you need me, I'll be, I flew myself all the way from Montreal to Calgary. At that time, I was still living in Montreal. And the next day I get a phone call and they said, hey, you're working in Edmonton tonight. It was a Saturday night. So I went there on a Friday night. Friday night was Calgary. Saturday night was Edmonton. Next morning, I get the phone call. He says, meet us here, pick you up. You go with the band to Edmonton. And I ended up starting to wrestle. But I only wrestled like maybe 3 times a week. In the wrestling business, back in those days, you'd do like 5, 6, maybe sometimes 7 shows in a week. That was very common. But I was just starting still. I was like my first or second year in the business. So I said, well, listen, whatever experience that I can pick up coming here. Great. So one night I did wrestle with Dynamite, and we did about 15 minutes. It wasn't a Matt classic on my end, but he was a great guy to work with. He's a solid worker. He's a solid, he's no nonsense. And I think I was there like 2.5 months, and then I left and I went to work for Don Owens in Portland. I got an opportunity. Actually, Al Tomko contacted me and Joe Ventura, and said, listen, you guys come down here and work for me for 6 weeks. I got a bunch of road trips lined up, and I'm bringing some midgets, and I'm bringing this and that, and we're going to do some spot shows. all over the province of BC. You guys help me out with this tour. I'll get you booked for Don Owens in Portland, Oregon. I'll get you some paperwork so you can get through the Washington border. So we said, hey, yeah, sounds good to me. So we headed out to Vancouver, and we worked for Al. And again, talking about Al being a good guy, he stuck to his part of the deal, and he got us booked with Don Owens. And I worked a good 6-7 months there for Don, and it was a great experience. I think when I worked for Don in 1980, from July to about mid-January, I really started picking up and learning the ropes of professional wrestling. But getting back to Stu and working for Stu, it was also a good experience. I got to meet some classics. There was Leo Burke there. This manager, I forget his first, John Foley. I think Foley was there. Brett, Bruce. It was okay. I remember getting my last payoff from Stu. I went over to the house before I went to Vancouver to work for Al. And, Stu's looking at me and he's going, he's looking at me, he's sizing me up and down, like I think. And so in the back of my mind, I'm going, he's got my check in his hands there. And I think he wants to invite me to his dungeon, but I ain't going there. I'm not going there. So I'm almost putting my hand on the check and trying to grab it and run and head for the hills. And he finally gave me my check and he said, listen, kid, maybe next time you'll have a better stay here and blah, blah, blah. So, okay, Stu, thanks. I'm glad I dodged the bullet.
Yeah, no kidding. Or had some of his eggs. We, as the legend goes, a lot of folks or fans included, first became aware of your work, myself included, as part of All Star. That was really the first nationally syndicated wrestling program in Canada. So it has a place in history. And I know Vance Nevada, who wrote an excellent book on the history of Canadian professional wrestling, gives promotion credit during that time. I wanted to ask you, though, run through a few names of folks that you worked there in All Star during your tenures, and just get a few thoughts on each, starting with a man who's ubiquitous on social media, Vicious Vern Seabird.
Well, Vicious Vern Seabird, I trained Vern. I was the one who got him started in professional wrestling. When I was working for Don Owens in 1980, every 2 weeks we had the wrestling promotion in Portland went to work for Al in Vancouver, and we'd do Monday nights at the Peony Gardens, and then we did Tuesday night TV at BC Television, BC TV. So Vern, all of a sudden, I guess he gravitated to me, and every time I'd walk into the building there at the Peony Gardens, he'd come up to me and he'd start getting friendly with me and start talking to me and asking me, how do you get into professional wrestling? And, I said, well, but, and it was over a period of time. And then finally, when I finished up in Portland, and I think I came back to work for Al after Portland in Vancouver in 1981, Vern again kept coming up to me and asking me, do you think, Rocky, you could train me? And blah, blah, blah. Well, I said, I'd heard at that time that there was a lot of the wrestlers, because the wrestling business was starting to decline a bit in 1981, that, especially in Vancouver, that some guys were starting to train guys for a little bit of sideline money. So I decided to jump in on that deal and say, well, okay, Vern, it's going to cost you this much, and let's give it a try. I don't have a wrestling ring, but if you know of anywhere we can do it here in Vancouver, let's do that. So yeah, I ended up training Vern Seabird in 1981, and after training him for 4 or 5 months, not like myself, I learned 2 wrestling holds and got in the ring. After training him for 4 or 5 months, he keeps telling me, he says, well, when are you going to introduce me to Al Tomko? Al Tomko, I want to be introduced to Al Tomko. So I said, wait, Vern, wait, give it a little more time, learn a little bit more. Because Vern was he wasn't very like overly muscular, or he wasn't a gym guy. Like he wasn't going to the gym very steady. I said to Vern, listen, okay, you're learning the wrestling moves, the wrestling falls. But one thing you got to do, and this is what you got to promise me, is that you got to hit the gym. You got to work out and build your body up, because why would somebody want to spend, $10 on a ticket to come and see you wrestle if his arms are bigger than yours? Yeah. So I really put that into his mind. And, Vern never ended up being a Mr. Super powerhouse in the weight room. But, he worked out and worked out and worked out. And, finally I get wind in 1982, 83. I was like in Montreal and stuff. And I'd heard, and he was telling me he would sometimes send me letters, and it was before we had email or cell phones or text messaging. He used to send me mail and showing me some posters of him. I ended up introducing it make a long story short. I ended up introducing Vern to Al, and then Al started him off as a referee. But Al did tell me, he says, you introduced me to Vern. He said, what do you want me to do with him? Well, I says, do whatever you can with him. So he started him off as a referee, and then he started off as a underneath preliminary boy. And then within 3-4 years, Al was starting to use him, on his mid card, even sometimes semi events. And Vern was learning how to get the heat, and he worked as a villain. I think he started as Vicious Vern Siebert, and then he went to Vern the Weasel Siebert, and then I came and worked in Vancouver. I think it was 1986, and I ended up doing a program with Vern. The teacher versus student program, and we did that on All Star Wrestling. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I know Vern very well, and I'm the one who broke him in.
That's great. What about, speaking of the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the weight room, but a really great heel that I think is underrated for his accomplishments, and that's unfortunately the late, great Ole Olsen.
Yeah, the great Ole Olsen, nicest guy in the world. Like, if you met Ole, like he was like professional wrestlers are a little bit crazy. Okay. I started noticing that actually my brother told me stories even before I got into business, but then when I got into business, I got to meet these guys in the dressing room, and they were all a little bit wild. But one thing about Ole is that he was a very conservative, normal guy. He wasn't, he didn't brag. He didn't, he's just a hard worker. He went to the gym, worked out hard, and when he got into the ring, he gave it his all. And he was a very credible professional wrestling. This man, you could put him on any wrestling card anywhere in the world, and people would look at his physique and his wrestling ability and say, this is a professional wrestler for sure. And he's similar, like myself a little bit, because before I got into wrestling, I was an introvert. And professional wrestling took the extrovert out of me to become an extrovert. But Ole was one of those guys that was probably an introvert. And then when he got in the ring, all of a sudden he was an extrovert. But in the dressing room, if you talk to Ole, he was just like a regular guy, and he was kind of like almost shy. But when he got in that ring, he wasn't shy anymore.
Absolutely. What about our mutual friend and a legitimate powerhouse and tough guy? And you would never hear those words out of him because he's very, very humble, but a man who's a legend in my books, and that's the rule enforcer, Doug Casson.
The rule enforcer, Doug Casson. I've got nothing but great things to say about Doug. He's a classy man. He's a gentleman. And I also trained Doug Casson in 1989. This is when wrestling was like getting, like, I think Al had lost the TV show at that point. or was on the brink of losing the TV show. So I started figuring, well, listen, wrestling's starting to die off a bit. And I don't know where I'm going to go with this, but I said to myself, well, maybe I should start trying to do some promoting some independent wrestling shows. And then I'll start my own wrestling training school. And so I put an ad in the province newspaper in Vancouver, and lo and behold, Doug Casson answers my ad, and he'd been talking to Al for a while, and he talked to me on the phone. He says, "Okay, Rocky, I'm going to meet up with you and let's go for a coffee, and we'll talk this over and blah blah blah." And so I told him my deal and what I was going to do, and he said, "Okay, well, you know what? You're going to train me, Rocky." I was almost ready to pay Al. I had the money in my hands. I was ready to pay Al, but you know what? I'm gonna train with you, Rocky. So I started training with Doug in 1989. It was the summer of '89, and I found out that Al had lost the TV show, and I said, well, you know what? I'm going to start promoting some wrestling myself, and I knew of this one gentleman. His name was Fred Roselli. He was a construction contractor in Vancouver, and he was interested in promoting wrestling. And me and Fred ended up buying Al's wrestling ring and wrestling belts, and we started our own wrestling promotion. So now I had access to my own wrestling ring, and I started training guys. And Doug was with somebody that I started training. And when I met Doug, when I looked at him, I said to myself, well, here's a guy. He was in his late 30s, but he looked the part, like he was credible. I went to the gym with him, and he was already, like he said, he told me he used to bench press way over 300 pounds. And I think that one time I went to the gym, he was still benching 300. So, and me and Doug, we got along real well. And he said, you know what, I'm going to help you and Fred with the promotion too. So he got into wrestling with the training and became a wrestler. And then he also came in as a partner with me and Fred in our wrestling promotion called Pacific Coast Championship Wrestling. And this is after Al had, gotten out of the business altogether. So, yeah, I got nothing but great things to say about Doug. We had a lot of fun. I'm sure he's got some great stories. And, our promotion, our indie promotion wasn't the most successful, but we tried real hard.
Yeah, he always speaks highly of you. And for those fans that want to learn more about Doug, I did an interview with him about 2.5 years ago on this channel, and it's a real good one. And it's interesting that you trained him because he trained me. So there you go.
Well, there you go.
It's amazing how the business works. You worked many times with a man that was a standout in the later years of All-Star, and he also worked other territories, etc. But I'm speaking about Diamond Timothy Flowers, and I know you had a rather bloody cage match in Cloverdale in '89. You want to talk about a professional wrestler, a heel? The guy really on TV came across as the personification of same. What are your memories of working with Tim? I know you worked him quite a lot.
I worked with Tim a lot. I did, yeah. And I have to say, here's another guy that was a great professional wrestler. He knew the business inside and out. I think his father was involved in wrestling. I think his father might have even promoted some wrestling. He's from New York State. Tim is. Tim, like I said, he was a great wrestler, but I have to say, when I started promoting indie wrestling, Tim came to work for me, and he was always kind of a little bit hard to deal with. Things always had to go his way. It was hard. I mean, it's hard enough to promote indie wrestling. But I mean, as far as a wrestler and his credibility in the ring, I got nothing but good things to say about him. But, I can't say anything really positive about him as a person. I think he, caused a lot of problems sometimes. And like here I'm doing all the work and promoting and putting my money up, and he's wanting to call the shots. And, I thought that wasn't fair. So we don't talk, me and Tim. And I know from other indie promoters here in Vancouver have told me the same story with Tim, was the same problems that I told them. And we kind of agreed that he was a bit of a, we used to call guys like that, like the dressing room lawyer or clubhouse lawyer, kind of getting everybody on his side and trying to go against the promotion. I think he did the same thing with Al Tomko. But I mean, as far as a professional wrestler, he had the talent for sure, and he had the look.
And I'd be remiss with not mentioning the great Michelle Starr, who, of course, carried the All-Star name on for years and years, and is quite involved in Cauliflower Alley to this day. Memories of working with him.
A lot of good memories of working with Michelle Starr. I remember when he came to Vancouver the first time. It was in 1988. He was like about 19 years old, so he was a really young guy. And, so he was a little bit green, but, I worked with him a lot and helped him along. And he picked up on the business real fast. And, next thing you know, push came to shove. Al had shut down, and then I tried promoting, and then Michelle Starr started promoting wrestling. And all I can say about Michelle Starr is that he's a hard worker. He took that All-Star Wrestling name, and he did really good. I mean, I think he did better than I did as a promoter, because he had social media on his side, but he hung in there during the years when there was no social media. So, but with social media and just the fact that he knew how to organize an independent wrestling promotion, I have to admit he was like real good, really good at doing what he was doing as an indie wrestling promoter. So he's a good guy. I got nothing but good things to say about Mark. I call him Mark because his real name is Mark Velios, but Michelle and me and him used to exchange stories about having to deal with Tim, and he had the same problems I had. And actually, I actually ended up running a few indie shows with Michelle, and they were quite successful. And I kind of let him, because he knew what he was doing. He was really good at organizing a wrestling show, and my strength was more being a salesman and trying to sell to sponsors and help out with the postering and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, Michelle Starr was definitely made to be a wrestling promoter for sure, and not a bad wrestler either.
No, absolutely not. Speak of the devil, Doug T-Bone Casson says, "Oh, I have a few stories, Rocky. You guys are looking good. We sure met a lot of nut bars, didn't we? I'm toasting you both with a hot rum right now, -20 in Alberta." God love you, Doug, for that. In terms of another fan question on social media, for whatever reason, All-Star at the time when the TV product was out there, I remember calling it Ed Carl Wrestling, the announcer, and I just wanted to the fan wanted to get your thoughts or memories of working with Ed Carl, who certainly had a unique style.
Well, he had a unique style. I mean, the only thing about Ed Carl, like, he wasn't like a Gordon Soley. I don't know if you've probably heard of Gordon Soley out of Atlanta, Georgia, and he did a lot of wrestling announcing from a lot of different promotions. He was right on the money with his announcing. The only problem with Ed Carl was that he didn't know the wrestling terminologies for wrestling moves. Other than that, he was a good announcer, but where he lost a little bit of credibility in his announcing was he wasn't up with all the terminologies, and somebody should have, like Al should have taken him aside and said, okay, well, when you see him do this move, then say this. It's this move. Like, okay, if he rolls him over this way, it's a small package. If he goes over him and rolls him up, it's a sunset flip. or this is a backslide, or, so somebody should have taken him to the side and kind of taught him the wrestling terminology, because sometimes he would call a suplex a body slam, or he'd call a body slam a suplex. So his wrestling terms were not good. But yeah, what he should have done is maybe listen to Gordon Soley a few times and, maybe pick up on that also. But I think it would have been up to Al, but at that time, Ed Carl was working for BC Television. He wasn't working for Al. So, Al can't just go up to him and say, well, listen, this is the way you got to say things. So, yeah.
That studio seemed to have a small but rather raucous vocal crowd at times. Do you have any particular standout memories from those TV tapings?
Yeah, I do. There was always one heckler in that TV studio would always go and say, "Hey, Rocky, where's Bullwinkle?"
Yes.
And I'd be going, "Oh my God, don't say that. Let's keep this serious here now." So yeah, it was a pretty rowdy crowd for a small crowd. I mean, there was maybe like 30 or 40 people. There was that little old Jessie. She used to come around and, with her purse, and looked like she had a couple of bricks in that purse, and she was ready to hit it over some bad guy's head and stuff. But she actually one year back at the Peony Gardens back in 1981, I was playing the villain and I'm wrestling Eric Froelich. And so I scoot out of the ring, and then all of a sudden I feel like 5 bottle caps going down my back, and it's old lady Jessie scratching me down the back, and I got 5 lines on my back and they're bleeding. So I go back to the dressing room and I'm taking a shower, and then Eric Froelich looks at me and he goes, "Oh my God," he says, "Well, let me help you out with that." So he lathered my back, and he says, "You put some alcohol on that." So she scratched my back like you wouldn't believe. But yeah, she loved her wrestling, and she was at all the shows at the Peony Gardens, Cloverdale Fairgrounds, and every TV taping she was there. For sure.
Yeah, that certainly. I thought for studio wrestling, and I mean everybody thinks of the Memphis version, but I always found that the BCTV seemed to have those very, very vocal fans / hecklers that made the product stick out.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I did wrestle for Memphis Television. Yeah, I would have to say it was very similar. Yeah, same type of studio shoot. I mean, a lot of the wrestling promotions back in the 70s, they were all doing it out of a TV studio, even in Montreal. And then, once the Vince McMahon Jr. or Vince McMahon Sr. and then WWF getting more popular, other promotions started thinking like, well, maybe we should do our TV filming in an actual arena to make it look, because the TV shoot after a while kind of started looking like we used to call it the Howdy Doody show. So, the TV studio kind of takes away a little bit from the whole thing, but, and then all of a sudden you got that Vince McMahon WWF coming on the air, and they're taking over all the TV spots. And then you compare, All Stars TV show studio to the Vince McMahon show, it looked a lot different.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One of the individuals who went on to quite a successful broadcast career was Mauro Ranallo, who got his start on All-Star TV as I guess he called himself the Voice Ranallo, and he was a heel manager, may have been a ref too. Did you see those qualities in him early on that would lead him to such a successful career?
Yeah, I thought he had a lot of potential. He was a good talker. I think they actually had him working alongside of Ed Carl for a while, doing the TV and stuff. And I think he ended up being like a DJ, and he worked. I think he works on a radio station somewhere in Chilliwack or something. Last I heard of. I haven't kept track of his career or anything like that, but definitely he was a good talker, and good kid, and yeah, lot of potential. I'm surprised that he never went further in wrestling, but it's not always easy, the wrestling business. So But
Actually,
he got his start
actually,
with also.
Actually, he did. He worked for he was the lead announcer on SmackDown for a while, and he just
Oh,
did
okay.
the
Okay.
yeah, he just did the Mike Tyson Paul boxing. He did a
Really?
lot of work in boxing, so he was very, very successful for
Well,
sure.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised for sure. Yeah.
In terms of your departure from there, and then you moved on to Pacific Northwest. You mentioned Don Owens as he appeared to be a very well regarded promoter, and that's saying something. What was your experience like working with Don directly?
Nothing but good things to say about Don. He was he was a nice man. Um, he was always encouraging me. He always liked the fact that, because I was wrestling like a villain there, but I always made sure that I wrestled a lot because, a lot of times promoters don't want, like I was an underneath preliminary wrestler there. So he'd want the first couple of matches to wrestle. So he always complimented me on my ability to be able to get some heat, but at the same time wrestle. He was a nice man. He was really good with the money. He paid when the money was there. You didn't have to worry. He paid you. And a funny thing is that on Thanksgiving, um, in when you work for Don, he'd because he had a farm and I guess he had a turkey farm. He'd give you a turkey on the U.S. Thanksgiving Day. Well, not a couple of days before Thanksgiving, he'd give you a turkey. So I remember giving my turkey to Buddy Rose because I was like only 20, 21. And Buddy told me, says, you can come over to my place and my wife and is going to cook dinner. And so I gave my turkey over to Buddy and Rip Oliver gave his turkey to Buddy. And they made about 3 turkeys and we ate turkey it was the only Thanksgiving I ever spent in the USA was 1980. And Don was just a funny guy, a nice guy, and a real nice man. His brother was a little unique, and his brother was he would also promote some wrestling shows in Don's wrestling promotion. His name was Elton Owen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You really worked some who's who there, including, and I'll go down the list, and you can perhaps give me a highlight of your in-ring time there. But you worked Rick Martel, Roddy Piper, Sheep Herders, Eric Embry, recently passed Ed Wisnowski, Colonel De Beers, right. Buzz Sawyer, Maniac, Matt Bourne. What in terms of all those names and your time in ring there, do you have any standout memories?
Well, the standout memories is that, like I'd mentioned earlier, is that when I got to wrestle in Portland, I thought that my ability as a wrestler was improving day by day because I got to wrestle with all these mat classics that, every night in the ring, I was learning more and more and more. And especially working with guys like Ed Wiskowski and Buddy Rose. I mean, they didn't call him Easy Ed for nothing. I mean, and talk about no panic. Easy Ed did not push the panic button. And, sometimes you just got to take your time and just, at the end of the day, it's we, the wrestlers, are working the people. If somebody says boring, we ignore that. We just go in there and we do our match because we're the professionals and we dictate professional wrestling. They're not going to start calling the high spots. We are. So, how can I say? Wrestling in Portland and wrestling with all these mat classics like Rick Martel and Roddy Piper and Matt Bourne and Buzzsaw Sawyer. It was an education in professional wrestling every night. And so, every night I came out of every match saying, I feel like I accomplished something.
Yeah, what a great territory it was. Fan Craig is asking, how many fans would you get in Vancouver Monday night at the PNE Gardens? Of course.
Well, in the good days, like I was there in '79, I was there in 1980 when the Portland guys were coming, so they had Martel and and Piper and the Sheep Herders, also known as the Bushwhackers, Playboy Buddy Rose, Wiskowski. It wasn't 2,500 at the Peony Gardens. I think one time we ran the Agrodome and we had like about 5,000 or 6,000 people. We were doing really good in 1980, and I think after Al had bought out Dawn and Gene, say it was about 81, 82, and didn't have access to all those Portland wrestlers coming in every second Monday, and so that he had to depend on bringing in his own people. I think wrestlers, I think that it started declining. But I've seen anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 people in Vancouver for a wrestling show, for sure.
Yeah, those certainly were the good old days of independence. A fan on social media wanted me to ask you about working in WWC Puerto Rico, and specifically matches that you had with another tremendous hardcore tag team before there was hardcore, the Moondogs.
Oh yeah, the Moondogs. Yeah, they were quite the characters. I mean, they were Moondogs. They were pretty wild, and if you knew them outside of the ring, they were just as wild as they were inside the ring. But yeah, they gave up the tag team belts to me and Pierre Martel, also known as Frenchie Martin, and great guys to work with. Real professionals. And I guess they were leaving the territory at that time, so they dropped the belts to me and Frenchie, and so we did a program with them for I think two or three different Saturdays in San Juan, and it was great. And I wrestled there as Gino Della Serra, because when I got there, they told me, well, we don't feel that Rocky's a really a wrestler's name. We'd like you to call yourself Gino Della Serra. So I said, well, okay, you can call me whatever you want. I'm just here to work and wrestle. So, Gino worked also, but, now when you look at it, after, The Rock, in the WWF, I guess that name kind of worked, and his father wrestled as Rocky Johnson, but, they said, you're going to wrestle as Gino. I said, okay. You guys signed the paychecks. I'll wrestle as whoever you want me to.
Did you find those Puerto Rico fans to be as uproarious as they can be or were?
Yeah, they're pretty wild. Now, when I wrestled there, I wrestled, as the babyface good guy. So I didn't have any problems with any fans. But there was one night that in particular that I'll never forget is Abdullah the Butcher and Frenchie Martin. This was like in the first couple of weeks that I was there, are having this all-out brawl in the ring, and it's a no disqualification, blah blah blah. And they say, well, okay, we want 4 wrestlers on the babyface side and 4 on the villain side, heel side, to come in and pull them apart. So here I am going to the ring with Tommy and Eddie Gilbert. And next thing you know, I get this rock about this size, hits me right in the chest. And it came out from the crowd. And I think they weren't aiming it at me because I was a good guy. So they were aiming it at Abdullah, but it ended up hitting me in the chest. And it's a good thing I did a lot of bench press in my time, because I didn't feel a thing. I felt something, but it just bounced off. And I said, what the hell was that? And then Tommy Gilbert, Eddie's dad, looks at me and goes, don't sell it. Don't sell it. I says, what? Don't sell it. If it hurts, I'll keel over. But it didn't hurt. And it was a good thing it didn't hit me in the face, because it would have rearranged my face quite a bit. They're pretty wild there. And I remember the security, they had these guys in like army pants walking around with these bats around the ring, and the heel wrestlers used to have to pick them up at a certain place. I think it was the Tanama Hotel. They'd all meet there, and the bad guys had to come in on a bus, not with their own cars, because their cars would get destroyed. They had to come in with a bus because, the fans can get pretty crazy out in San Juan. So they took their wrestling seriously in San Juan. and they didn't like the bad guys. My brother Bob got hit over the head by a 2x4 in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. So yeah, you can ask him about that story.
Wow, that's when they really still believed for sure. I wanted to ask you about some of your experience working with Dory Funk Jr. Those that seems to be one of the highlights of your in ring tenure anyway, from a technical standpoint. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. Yeah, wrestling with Dory Funk. I mean, he's a Matt classic. I wrestled him one time only, but one time, and that was in Portland, Maine. Was in 1985. I went to work for the Puerto Rican wrestling office, and they were kind of working along with Angelo Savoldi. He was a local promoter in Portland, Maine, in Rhode Island, in the Connecticut area. And so when I finished up in Puerto Rico, they said, well, you can go work in Boston for a week. And then from Boston, you're almost in Montreal. So anyway, I went to work there. And then, I think it was the second night I was there, I worked with Dory Funk in Portland, Maine. And they were doing kind of like an angle. He was doing a kind of an angle with Carlos. And so Carlos was at ringside, and him and Carlos were getting into it. But at the same time, he was working with me. And yeah, we put on a nice little match. I mean, we did a lot of good stuff, a lot of wrestling. He likes to wrestle. I did a little bit of wrestling with him, and we had a good solid. It just kind of flowed like, guys like Dory Funk and guys like Ric Flair, well, they could make a broom look good. So, and I'm not a broom. So the match was really, really good. I really enjoyed it. And, he was a solid worker but he knew what he was doing. And at the same time, he made me shine a bit. And at the same time, he got himself over, and the match got over. And I kind of was like there to help him and Carlos get their angle over. And that was my job. So, pay me and, tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it.
You were involved or you had quite a successful run in international wrestling in Montreal. You had some great tag matches there against the Rougeaus with Bob, if the record serves correctly. And a lot of fans remember your work from that time on their television program. They had some great personalities on there, Creechman's Corner, et cetera, et cetera. And I noticed that you worked some co-promoted events with the WWF in about '85 in Montreal. Was there ever any consideration on your part to try your hand at the WWF, or how did that ever transpire?
Well, it didn't transpire, unfortunately. But I mean, yeah, I tried. I mean, I'd sent them some videotapes of my work and stuff. And I actually got booked in 1987 on a wrestling show, on a WWF wrestling show. Me and Bob did in Cornwall, Ontario. And I worked with Louis Laurence. For some reason, I always end up sometimes working with Louis Laurence. But anyway, I worked with Louis, and Bob worked with Gino's son. And we got to work that night. This was after international wrestling had folded. But working for international wrestling, I mean, in the beginning of international wrestling, me and Bob, we kind of realized that they weren't going to kind of push us. So we'd come back to Montreal, and we'd mostly work undercard matches. But in 1987, when Vince McMahon Jr. started cherry picking all the wrestling territories and picking up all the main event wrestlers in every wrestling territory there was. So in Montreal, they took the Bravo and the Rougeaus and Rick Martel. So all of a sudden, the Creechmans decided to join up in partnership with Gino Brito. And because the the Creechmans kind of liked us, the Della Serra brothers. They kind of gave us a bit of a push, and Floyd always told us, like even back in the early 80s, he used to tell us, listen, if I had anything to do with the card here, you and your brother Rocky, or Rocky, you and your brother Bob would be higher up on the card. And definitely when he became partners and his father Eddie became partners with Gino, he came through with his promise and definitely gave me and my brother a push, for sure. And I'm thankful for that. And that was my only opportunity, was to get a push in Montreal, was when the Creechmans came in and partnered up with Gino. But I mean, when International started back in the early 80s, they were kind of a little bit affiliated with the WWF, with the old man, Vince Sr., and they were more about bringing in guys from out of town. It was kind of the idea is that wrestling fans are going to pay money to see wrestling and watch wrestlers that come from somewhere else than watch local boys. Mm. So in other words, I'm more valuable in Puerto Rico because I'm coming from, Montreal, or I'm better in Vancouver because I'm coming from Montreal, but in Montreal, I'm Rocky Della Serra from Montreal. So wrestling fans always like to see wrestlers that come from somewhere else, just for a bit of a variety in wrestling, And at that time, in the territory years, we used to wrestle sometimes in the same town every week. That doesn't happen no more. So you can't have the same faces on the card every week. You got to change it around a bit. So me and Bob in the early 80s, we realized that. And so we always made sure that we left Montreal and went and worked in other territories.
Speaking of other territories, the fans of the Hannibal TV are some of, the most well-versed on wrestling history. And I would say, excuse me, this is a deep cut. In Atlantic Grand Prix, you had a run with another guy gone too soon, the late Rick Valentine, Kerry Brown.
I didn't know that.
Wanted to know your memories of working that territory, and especially working with Brown.
Kerry Brown you're talking about. And also I wrestled with his uncle, Bulldog Brown. Well, with Bulldog, he was a real old school pro wrestler. And in 1982, I ended up getting a cauliflowered ear, this one right here. And so in the ring, and sometimes these cauliflowered ears just come out of nowhere. It could be just somebody's finger hitting a certain part of your ear. Next thing you know, my ear started swelling. So I went up and I'm working against Bulldog, and I go to Bulldog and I go, listen, Bulldog, is it okay, like, if you don't do the pile driver tonight? Because my ear was like this, and it was like swollen like this. And he goes, don't worry about it, kid. I'll take care of you. Don't worry. And so I get to the ring, and he gives me the pile driver anyway. Next thing you know, I had to get it drained 3 times. But yeah, I worked with his nephew, Kerry, who was working as Rick Valentine. And he kind of looked a little bit like Greg the Hammer Valentine a bit, with his blonde hair and his face and stuff together. He looked like he was related to Greg the Hammer. Anyway, his finishing move was a superplex from the top turnbuckle. So, I worked with him for about a week and a half. I was kind of setting him up for Leo Burke, because Leo Burke was like the top babyface in the Maritimes. He was like a god there, kind of like Carlos is in San Juan, and so is Dino Bravo and the Rougeos in Montreal, Rick Martel. So I worked with Rick, and he gives me this superplex. It was the first superplex I ever took in my life. And this is where he puts you on the top turnbuckle. He gets up on the second rope and suplexes you to the middle of the ring. Well, I'll tell you, it's a feeling like a tree, when the tree, they chop the tree and it goes timber. Well, it was the same feeling. As I'm going over in the suplex, I'm feeling like, when am I going to hit the mat? And then all of a sudden you hit the mat, boom, and you get that little wind, you get a little winded, and then you just shake it off and say, okay, it looks like I'm going to live to wrestle another day.
Yeah, high impact for sure. You were on that tour of Newfoundland in '88 that claimed the life of adorable Adrian Adonis and several other wrestlers in that tragic van accident when I believe they swerved to miss a moose. What are your memories of that unfortunate tour and situation?
It was a, it's definitely a memory that I'll never forget. Um, I mean, I remember I was working for Al back in '88, and um, the Bearman got in touch with me and said, "Listen, I'm doing a tour in Newfoundland. It's going to start in Labrador, and then we're going to head to Newfoundland, and we're going to do about 6 weeks. And are you interested in coming? And it's going to be good. The money's going to be good, and everything." So I said, "Well, yeah. I mean, Al's going to finish up here pretty soon, because he'd usually close down before summertime." And then they just put reruns on of television shows on in the summer. So I said, okay, I'll come down. So he flew me in from Montreal. I went to Montreal, visit the family, and then he flew me into Montreal to Labrador. And I got there, and Whipper Billy Watson Jr. met me at the airport, and he was telling me, yeah, me and he had this other guy with him. He says, we came here 6 weeks before, and we telemarketed on the phone, calling people all over Labrador, selling them wrestling tickets and telling them that we got a wrestling show coming. And they had 4 shows in Labrador. And then, of course, the Bearman had posters and advertising all over Newfoundland, and we had about another, 5-6 weeks there. So anyway, we, worked the first night. We got about 2,000 people in the first night in the first town of Labrador. I can't remember the names of the cities in Labrador, but there's not too much there. But there seemed to be a lot of people coming to wrestling because they don't get that kind of entertainment very often. Adorable Adrian was on the card, and they had Hartford Love from St. John's, Newfoundland, or St. John's, Newfoundland. They had some midgets. They had the bear, and the Bearman was wrestling the bear. A couple other guys I remember on the card. Stevie Ocean was there. Ricky Johnson, Rocky Johnson's brother, was there. So, everything started, going along. Next night, we have another show, and something in my mind started going. My mind started playing tricks on me. I started saying to myself, there's just something wrong. There's something wrong with this road, this tour. I don't know what it was. I mean, the crowds were good. The shows were good. He had everything that you needed to draw a crowd. He had adorable Adrian, fresh off the WWF. He had the midgets. He had the bear. We were drawing people. But something in the back of my mind said that something's wrong. So I, at that time, was the mother of my children was pregnant with our first child, and I would call her, and I told her, I says, there's something strange about this tour. I don't know what it is. And she asked me, she said, well, what do you think? What is it? I said, I don't know. So, and I've been on like so many road trips in my life, and so many road, tours and stuff. And so anyway, we finish up in Labrador. It was successful. Everything's good. We take this ferry ride that took almost 3/4 of a day, and we went to Newfoundland from Labrador, and we had a pretty wild time on the ferry going to Newfoundland. And the boys, the Kelly twins were. Oh yeah, the Kelly twins were on the card. And they kept asking me, when we get to Newfoundland, you want to travel with us? So I said, well, okay, sure. And then next thing you know, before that, they said, well, listen, Adrian Adonis is going to travel with us. So I said, okay, well, I'm traveling with Whipper Billy Watson Jr. All is good. I'll just keep traveling with him. We're good. So I see the Bearman as we're getting off the ferry going to Newfoundland, and we're in Newfoundland. I think we're in Lewisport. And he looks like he's a little bit under the weather, and he looks like he's drinking a bit. So I guess, the boys, the Kelly twins and Adrian and those guys were drinking quite a bit that day. And I was, it was a day off. The first day we got to Newfoundland, we had a day off, and me and Ricky Johnson, well, I remember vividly, we were playing pool at the hotel, and then we get this call, and Adonis and the Kelly twins and the Bearman are in a fatal car accident, blah, blah, blah. We drove to the hospital, and we're going, what the hell's going on here? So I get to the hospital, and as soon as we got there, they said, Adrian Adonis, Keith Franks, I think was his real name. I'm not quite sure, but yeah. Anyway, they said he just died. And I guess one of the Kelly twins and the Bearman died initially in the car accident. And from what I understand, I don't know if it was drinking and driving or if they missed a moose or what, but those two guys were dead. And Adrian had just died, and then one of the other Kelly twins was, crippled up. So it was a really bad accident. And so we leave the hospital, and we're all of us in the car, me and Ricky and Whipper Billy Watson. We're saying to ourselves, what's going to happen to this tour now? I guess we might be just SOL here. And yeah, we were. Next day we started talking. We said, may as well head back home and go back home. And I guess the tour has been canceled. So it was pretty tragic, for sure.
Yeah, underscores how dangerous the business was in the territory days when you're doing all that traveling on the road, for sure.
A lot of I witnessed it in Montreal, in Chicoutimi, Quebec, also when Mad Dog LaFive and Tarzan Tyler and Adrian Desbois, the referee, they all died in a car accident coming from Chicoutimi, coming back to Montreal on Christmas Eve morning, 1985. So yeah, these cars. Well, it's because we spend so much time on the road in those days. A lot of times the joke was, how much you making in that territory? Well, I'm doing 3,000. You making $3,000? No, I'm doing 3,000 miles a week. Mm-hmm. So we traveled a lot, especially in Memphis. We travel a lot. In the Maritimes, we travel a lot. Mm-hmm. And the more you're on the road, the more chances of these things, happening. But in the case of Adrian and the Bearman and those guys, I think it was, from what I heard, was more drinking and driving.
Sad. We have time, Rocky, for one last fan question that they sent in over social media, and they wanted to know about your experience working about 95 with some matches with Jimmy Superfly Snuka at that stage of his career.
Yeah, Jimmy Superfly Snuka. Yeah, I worked with him when Michelle Starr was promoting wrestling in the Cloverdale Fairgrounds. I worked with him. I'm pretty sure it was me and I was working as the Quebecer, and he brought Jimmy Superfly in for a weekend or 2-3 shows, Cloverdale, and we did a town outside of Victoria called Esquimalt, and I can't remember Nanaimo, BC. And yeah, I worked 3 nights with Jimmy Superfly, a real professional, polished professional wrestler. Great matches working with him, a complete gentleman. Just again, a night off to work with, and nothing but good things to say about him. He was just a real, he didn't have no ego or anything like that, like I'm Jimmy Superfly or anything like that. He was just a down-to-earth professional wrestler that was in the business because he loved wrestling, and he was successful at it and made money at it, and that's why he was in it. And that was always the objective, was that you get into the business because you like to wrestle and you want to make some money and you want to make a name for yourself. And Jimmy Superfly Snuka, I mean, talk about somebody that I saw wrestle on WWF and the Frank Tunney Wrestling, NWA. He was everywhere. He was a big name.
Well, I think we've more than whet the fans' appetite for your book, and before we let the fans know where they can get your book and your other items and your social media presence, wanted to wrap it up. And I know you've had so many great experiences in your career, but what would you say? And this is kind of a difficult question, I know, to boil it down, but what would you say you are most proud of in your career, and what would you like the fans to remember you by?
Well, I want the fans to remember me by as being somebody that when he went in the ring, gave it all, his best. Tried my best to, put on a good show, a good match. I gave it my best. I tried hard, sometimes it wasn't always there. Getting closer to the end of my career, I wasn't, I was getting older, so I wasn't the same worker I was when I was younger. But I just want people to remember me as somebody that went in the ring and gave it 100%, and tried hard and enjoyed professional wrestling. And being a Canadian and having the opportunity to wrestle, and I'd just like to say this, that I think back in the 80s, I was probably one of the only wrestlers that actually wrestled in every province in Canada except Manitoba, and wrestled in every small town from Twillingate, Newfoundland to Prince Rupert, British Columbia. And just, I love Canada. And I remember, wrestling in all those towns, and sometimes we had good crowds and sometimes we had some real bad ones. But it doesn't matter how many people are there, I always gave it my best.
Excellent.
And I just want to say that my book is not out yet. The final draft is done. It's just about, getting it to print and getting it out there in the market, and it'll be on the market. You'll be able to get it online. You'll be able to contact me on, social media. And I also got pictures that I'll be selling. If you want any nostalgic Rocky Della Serra pictures from back in the 80s, I'll have those also. And I'm actually going to a wrestling show tonight in Abbotsford, BC, and they're also called All-Star Wrestling, and I'm going to be involved in that show and promoting my book and promoting my pictures, and just it'd be nice to come and see what wrestling looks like. So I'm looking forward to that. So after this interview, I'm heading out to Abbotsford. So still got my foot in wrestling in kind of with the book and going to the show tonight. And I'm also going to be in Cloverdale on March the 8th, and I'm going to be a special referee that night.
That's excellent. What's your social media contact handles? I know you're on Facebook.
I'm on Facebook. That's the best way to reach me. I'll also, if you wanted to get a book, you can always get a book through me when it's going to be available, and it will be available soon. I'd say about a month or so. You can reach me on Facebook. And like I said, it'll always be available online. The publisher is Scott Teal. My co-author is Zachary Carey. Me and Zachary started talking during COVID in 2020. He's a wrestling historian. And we came up with the idea. It was during COVID, and back then we were all social distancing. So we wrote the book through me talking to him on the phone and him having a recorder on the other side in Boston while I'm talking to him here in Vancouver. And then the publisher is Scott Teal, who also was involved in the book, Ron Hutchison's wrestling book also. So that should be out in about a month. Wrestling fans, keep your eyes open. And thank you for the opportunity, Jack. It was great talking to you.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and we'll keep in touch to get the word out to the fans of the Hannibal TV to when the book drops and where they can get that, and also follow you on Facebook. And I'm going to be getting my 8x10 signed, so I would encourage the fans to as well. So Rocky, want to thank you very much for your time for this career interview. Certainly was a thrill for me, and we'll definitely keep in touch. And good luck in your endeavors continuing in the wrestling business.
Thank you, Jack. Have a good one. Take care. Thanks for having me again.
Well, fans, that's it for this special Saturday edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast with the legendary Rocky Della Serra. Be sure to subscribe to the Hannibal TV if you haven't yet, and hit that notification button, and you won't miss content like this. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news.